Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pamela Cohn, and I'm the founder and CEO of Amity Advisory, an ESG consulting firm for law firms. I also serve as the host of this podcast. We are so fortunate to have with us today Lee Shankland Gort of Addleshaw Goddard. He is the head of ESG, the head of social sustainable and green finance at the firm. So welcome, Lee. We are so eager to have a conversation with you today.
Thanks very much, Pam. I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking to you and really looking forward to it. So thank you.
So let's start with a little bit about your practice and your role at Addleshaw. How did you get to where you are now?
So I'm a transactional finance lawyer by background, and I've been at Addleshaw's now for 26 years this year, with the exception of a year spent on qualification at a US firm and then came back to Addleshaw's. And my practice as an early lawyer gravitated towards social housing finance, which is essentially acting for lenders, private investors and other financial institutions into the UK's social housing finance market. And to give you a flavour, that the size of that market is about 130 billion of debt. And my firm acts on the majority of those transactions for the majority of lenders. And that I guess was the starting point for me of getting into that social finance space. You know, as a young lawyer, I started doing much more leverage finance and other types of transactions, which could be, it felt like there were, when there was shareholder extraction in the transaction, it wasn't as palatable a deal for me personally. I didn't get the enjoyment out of it. And so working in the social finance space, where it felt like there was a common goal and an end, and actually ultimately the executive of the organization is not really taking a big return. It's about helping provide homes for the people in housing poverty. That type of thing really attracted me. So that was around 2002, 2007, I was made head of the team. And at that time, we got promoted in the 2 UK legal directories, Legal 500 and Chambers, to the #1 firm in the country acting for funders. I should say, and I do want to make it clear that that's coincidental, that it happened when I got promoted, and it's down to a whole host of colleagues, both former colleagues who've since retired or moved on, as well as current colleagues that keep us there. But we spent the time since then at the top of those rankings, which back then was quite unusual for Addleshaw's, as it was as a firm, a much smaller firm, to be in a city finance practice ranked ahead of what we used to call, I don't know if it's still the case, but magic circle law firms and US law firms, was quite unique. And for me, it was that whole social finance space that really was the captivating interest point for me. Fast forward to, I suppose, 2014, I became co-head of banking at the firm and spent about 5 years doing management of other partners, and then decided that actually it was taking me a little bit too far away from clients, markets, and the work that I enjoy doing most, which is that whole space of solutions and engagement with clients. So I took a step back from that, decided I wanted to do something different. And around that time, we'd started to do, before Loan Market Association came up with any criteria, we'd started to do some sustainable finance, some sustainability linked loans, largely for, at the time, overseas lenders into the UK social finance market. And there was a clear narrative where they would land on a sustainable basis into that social finance market. And started to develop some green products which were more aligned to lenders' wholesale financing requirements, as opposed to Loan Market Association or bond principles. It was deviating from those. And so we decided to have a look at our practice again and where we needed to be and where our clients wanted to be. And it was to move more towards that social, sustainable and green finance practice. And I guess one thing that plays heavily on my mind is the longevity of the practice after I'm no longer here. In the sense of, and I'm sure this happens for everybody who has an employee role, but as an employer role, sorry, that, we want to make sure that there is a continuum of work coming into colleagues and that they have that sustainable career going forward. So that was one of the motivations as well. It was a case of, okay, we are the number one firm in social housing finance practice. We've got a huge practice, incredibly profitable. We work on the best transactions for fantastic clients, but that's quite static. We need to grow to create opportunities for colleagues who are working hard to build their careers. So part of it was actually driven by that desire to create those opportunities for colleagues. At the same time, I said to our current managing partner, John Joyce, that I wanted to focus on ESG, largely from the perspective of what we might offer to clients, but also with an interest in what we're doing ourselves as a business. And so that was starting to form in the background, particularly given that my finance work could be badged as ESG finance and my team's finance work as well. Although I prefer to call it social finance or sustainable finance or green finance. So that was around 2018. We then had lockdown, as we all know, and a very different dynamic and working practice. And at the time, we started looking as a business what we wanted and needed to do in terms of ESG in the wider sense. So from a board, from an executive perspective, and we employed an outside consultant, a lady called Sue Bonney, who is phenomenal. She was the former chair of KPMG in the UK and the head of ESG, to kind of do some research and tell us what she felt we needed to do differently. And I was interviewed by Sue, and what I didn't realize is that she was interviewing me for a more formal head of ESG role, along with other partners, and that was the recommendation that came through. So my first thinking around that was, it was presenting to the board, looking at what we do as a business, and my starting point really was, we can only leverage our experience to advise clients in this space if we can demonstrate that we're also focusing on these areas, or we're also making progress. I'm very, very conscious. I don't want us to hold ourselves out in any way as being on a pedestal, because I think every business is on a journey, and I'm very conscious that I don't like us and don't want us as a business to get virtue signaling in any way over these things, because it's important that we can resonate with our clients who are tackling different types of ESG issues, whether that's climate, biodiversity, whether it's human rights. There's a whole plethora out there, as we both know. But I felt it was very important that we focused on what we was doing internally first. So spent the first 12 months with a more formal head of ESG approach, looking at what we need to do as a business and where we needed to make perhaps some changes, where we were doing things good already, where we could galvanize people to make progress. And what became clear is we was doing a huge amount of great stuff throughout all parts of the business, but we wasn't necessarily joining the dots internally. We wasn't shouting about that. And that's probably still the case. And part of me likes that as well, I should say, because I do have this worry about looking like you're virtue signaling. So, our DE&I approach that recently won as a pass-through place on BT's panel, where we didn't have to go through the procurement process, because they made it clear whichever law firm that had the best in their minds, the most resonant DE&I success would get an automatic pass-through, and they awarded that to Addleshaw's. Now that's great. It really is something that we're proud of. And that's down to the impact that's being made with various people across the firm at various levels through all parts of the business, not just the lawyers, not just the partners, but a huge amount of people are responsible for delivering that. And there was all sorts of little things like that happening that we just were not being, I suppose, joined up about.
Mhm.
Partly because of who we are and our culture as a business, that I think we hide our light under a bushel to some extent. So it was easy to look at where we are and think about where we needed to where things need to continue to evolve. And the big pressure point for me was, and our board and our executive bought it, was that clients are increasingly going to make purchasing decisions not just based on quality or price, but based on the impact you have as one of their suppliers, positive or negative to them, whether
Mhm.
that impact is in a scope 3 perspective or whether that impact is in a reputational perspective. That is ultimately a deciding factor, and therefore we need to be all over that and got that support. And that is being driven forward. We already had a head of responsible business in place, a fantastic colleague called Mary Peterson, and Mary is driving all of that forward, which frees me up now to step back into the client development space and looking at what we can offer to clients that's different and really where we can take things forward from there. So I guess where I end up now is with the social, sustainable, and green finance practice hat, and that's very much a balance sheet management. I have a group of partners working with me and probably about 50 lawyers focusing on that full time, and then a more wider cross-sector, cross-office ESG leadership role, which is about galvanizing our offering to clients.
I love what you brought up about, if we're going to be out there offering our expertise to clients on this, we have to be able to demonstrate that we are on the journey as well. I think that's a train that too many law firms are missing. They all see the opportunity with ESG advice, and I think that's wonderful. It is a huge opportunity, but they're forgetting that, we also are an operating business and we need to consider these things for our own business. And the advantage that brings, as you mentioned, is we're on the journey too. We know the pain points. We know what works and what hasn't. And it actually is another connection point with your clients to share successes or challenges on the journey. I want to talk a little bit more about what you're seeing within your clients. What are the hot topics emerging right now on ESG? What are they coming to you for advice for?
It's a really good question, and I agree with everything you've just said there, by the way. So our business is incredibly broad. We act for 52, I think, FTSE 100 companies, but also because of our historical growth through mergers, we act for smaller SMEs as well, and they're just as important. All clients are to us. And so it's difficult to give a kind of homogenized view of where clients are, or indeed what their approach is. We have some clients that I would say, and they would probably say, are more advanced in their thinking than where we are. And they've had this on their agenda, the board agenda, for not just 5-6 years, but going back really to 2005, 2006, principles of responsible investment and what the investor community started to ask them for. And you're right, an absolute key feature for me in terms of the ESG space and all of our colleagues that operate in this space is that it requires humility and it requires an element of, well, more than an element, a large degree of collaboration, but it requires the ability to say to clients, look, we're co-creating here a little bit because we are on a journey. And some of those clients are probably offering us knowledge more than what we're offering them, to be fair, at that end of the spectrum. But then we have other clients, and it's not necessarily size driven or geographical driven. Some of our very largest clients are saying to us, we don't know where to begin. We know, you'll get a head of legal saying, I've been given ESG, it's on my to-do list. Don't really have much of a budget for it at the moment. Can you tell me what I need to be thinking about? And in a way, they're the great conversations that, as a lawyer, because although we welcome the areas where we can do a bit of our clients can do us a bit of learning into us, being able to get in there and offer some thinking and help clients think outside the box is absolutely key. And that for me is a key feature where we try and take ESG in terms of our legal services. It's to move it away from a pure risk and compliance driven approach, and back very much to the basis of ESG, which I guess I mentioned a few moments ago, the principles of responsible investment, the idea that if essentially sustainability from a UN perspective wasn't being driven forward by governments cooperating, nations are not quite united as what perhaps they thought in the 80s when sustainability and sustainable development was coined. So principles of responsible investment is all around stakeholders influencing change. They're obviously focused on investors, as you and I both know, but we know that it's employees, it's customers, it's suppliers, it's funders, it's the communities in which you operate. So where we try to take ESG in terms of clients is say, okay, the law might require you to do this. This might be what the disclosure regime is saying you need to start thinking about, but that might just be the bare minimum. And what you need to think about is what additional stuff do you need to be either considering KPIs on or looking at how you monitor or looking at your operations to be able to authentically come up with a narrative about to show you're having impact, because your stakeholders or different aspects of your stakeholders are going to expect more than the bare minimum. And that I personally like being in that territory as a lawyer, but I think for some lawyers, it feels a bit too shades of gray and not black and white. And so it feels like it's more consulting than business advice, etc. So you're consulting on business advice rather than legal advice. But I think that's really where we need to be as lawyers going forward. And again, if I come back to where I see the next generation of lawyers coming through with the advent of technology, AI, well, not the advent, it's been around for decades, but the advent of generative AI, I should say, their work life is going to be very different than mine was 25 years ago, starting in this profession, and it will continue to evolve. And therefore, I feel that they need to be more holistic, business-focused, client-focused colleagues who can engage and not feel unnerved because they don't have an answer or there isn't a legal answer, but help get into what the underlying solution is and what stakeholders expect. And for me, ESG in that perspective opens up a whole new world of creative thinking, solution-driven within the realms of law.
And being proactive, right? It requires, to be a trusted business advisor, you have to think and look towards the future, where I think historically lawyers' mindset has been, what's today's problem and what's the legal solution? So I think you're right. It's going to take a whole evolution of the way lawyers work. And I think for the younger generations, that's quite an exciting opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we are behind the curve compared with other professions that have been much more comfortable operating in that space. But what we as lawyers can offer, that I'm not saying they can't offer, but it might be more difficult for some of the other professions that are operating in the ESG advisory space to offer, is not just finding the challenge, but helping with the solution if the legal answer is part of the solution. And inevitably, if you have that trusted relationship, and we're in a world where everybody is on a journey from a climate perspective, there will be supply chain issues that crop up given the extensive nature of supply chains. You need a lawyer alongside you to help with some of those more challenging reputational issues that throw up. And that's something that I think the legal profession has only just started waking up to, the opportunities for it from an ESG advisory perspective.
I completely agree. You mentioned a couple of times virtue signaling. And of course, we're in this world of, at least here in the US, rapid litigation response to greenwashing accusations, to new regulations, to, virtue signaling. What are you seeing in the UK and with your clients? And what do you think the result of all of this scrutiny will be on progress?
This is where I come across perhaps most glass is half full than in other scenarios. So undoubtedly what's happening in the US, where I think it goes beyond, ultimately there are going to be greenwashing issues that's out there, and it's quite right that that gets stamped on and challenged, because if we do take the view that ESG is all about stakeholders, then stakeholders need to be able to make informed decisions on where they purchase, where they employ, who they fund, based on the quality of the information that's out there. And so the veracity of that information, whether it's through a more regulatory disclosure regime or it's what a business puts out, is absolutely key. And I agree entirely with that. Where I think we're seeing things happen in the US, and I hope I don't offend you by saying this, is that
No, not
sometimes
at all.
litigation is being used more as a tool to restrict progress, as opposed to an actual tool to restrict false statements. And I think that's possibly more in the fiduciary duty space as well. And undoubtedly, that has created a wave of nervousness that I've seen within the UK financial services sector, and my colleagues who operate in other jurisdictions are saying they see as well. So there is that ripple effect through what's happening in terms of the US. Now, this is where I start to sound a little bit, I suppose, glass is half full. I just go back to the first principles that ESG is about finding a solution when you can't rely on legislatures or you can't rely on governments to deliver it, and it's about stakeholders coming together. So I see it as more I suppose, more a hump in the road than something that's going to be the demise of ESG. And that's the way I take that view. You know, it might mean that there is more caution exercised, but it might be that there's more caution needed in some instances. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I don't think ultimately we will. I mean, we've seen it in the EU recently with CS3D. We've seen it in the UK with policy announcements that are stepping back from what people was expecting. Undoubtedly, what's happening in the US has slowed progress down, but I don't think it will stop progress. And I think ultimately, I suppose, ultimately the wheel's rolling now, and it has been rolling for a long time, and the momentum has been gathered. They might be able to slow that momentum, but it's going to continue. And that, then I think the worry is, will we get there in time? Will we get there in time from a climate perspective in particular? And you start to hear things like what was, I suppose, sustainable finance now being called transition finance or adaptation finance, and this whole concept of, well, what if we don't quite reach the target in the timescale that we feel that the world needs to achieve it? Then where do we go from there? And it's okay to have that as a plan B, but it has to be a fallback rather than where we end up in terms of the aim.
Right. I completely agree with you. I feel like the train has left the station on ESG, particularly outside the US, and that's not going to stop. And I think eventually the US will have to catch up in order to stay in the game, and just for, the survival of society. So eventually we're going to get there. We just have a few hiccups along the way. So this is such a fast moving area. When I invite you back a year from now to have another podcast discussion, what will we be talking about? What will be on the agenda in 1 year's time?
Oh gosh, I hope I've done well enough to get an invite back at some point in the future. So that's lovely. But I know that's more a hypothetical question. So I think in a year's time we're going to see a different political environment across many parts in the globe, and that change will create its own inertia. So I don't think we'll progress as quickly as what we might have wanted to progress. Regardless of where the EU and the European Council landed on CS3D, I do think we'll see much more supply chain connectivity, as I call it, to drive change. So we've seen it with Scope 3, we've seen it with CS3D, particularly around human rights as well as climate. I would imagine the next area is going to be biodiversity and aquatic diversity and water temperature, where water in particular, I guess, that more focus starts to look at those, and you start to have to report how that's happening across your supply chain and what the impact is and whether it's adversely impacting or not. with the expectation that you then adjust your purchasing decisions based on that as a business to business approach. So I think we'll start to see the emergence of those. We've obviously got IFRS on the horizon, S1 and S2, and businesses starting to really focus on that financial sustainability challenge. And so in a year's time, I'd hope that a lot more businesses were more advanced in that thinking. I think it's come as a surprise to some, and again, not a surprise to others, depending on where they are in that spectrum.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, but I'd hope I'm more optimistic, let's say. Even though I'm glasses half full, I'd hope that even with the political changes we'll see, I'll still be more optimistic in a year's time.
Well, and that leads to my final question, because I love to ask people before we wrap things up. Given the challenges of this space that we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes, what gives you hope? Why do we keep doing this?
So I guess what gives me hope is the generations that are following us that care more about this than perhaps my generation did at their level. And whilst I think everybody, whatever your position in life, whether you'll want to make sure that the impact on your family, your community, your children is minimized, we'll all have that broader view. I think we've got some really sharp thinkers in the next generation that are prepared to stand up and be counted. And I think my generation was a bit more ready to go with the status quo. So it's that gives me hope. And then the other thing that gives me hope is, again, coming back to this, that ESG is all stakeholder. For me, ESG is just stakeholder capitalism. There is capitalism. And once people start to realize more and more that there are opportunities, whether it's new technology or it's new renewable energy sources or it's different ways of adapting or solving some of these challenges, then the money will start to flow. And I think that will overcome those views that still remain that would say we're just a bunch of woke capitalists in the ESG space, or it's too big to even tackle. I think that power of next generation and underlying entrepreneurship is what will drive us forward.
I think so too. I think the younger generation realizes this is like the opportunity of their lifetime, and it is only going to work to their benefit to leverage and work on these things for those ultimate goals. So I do look forward to chatting with you again in 1 year's time, and we'll see how accurate our predictions were. Thank you so much for your time and for having this conversation with us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'd love to keep the conversation going. But thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Speak soon.